Mavic Thompson, a lonely millionaire with everything except true happiness, decides to spend New Year's at the house of his maid, Jezia. What starts as a simple invitation turns into a life-changing experience for both of them. Watch to see how a night of warmth, family, and real connection transforms Mavic's life forever. Once upon a time in a bustling city, there was a millionaire named Mavic Thompson. Mavic was in his late 30s, tall, handsome, and had everything money could buy. He lived in a massive mansion with shiny marble floors, expensive cars parked outside, and a huge swimming pool in the backyard. People admired him, and he was known as one of the richest men in the city. But even though Mavic had all the money in the world, he was lonely. He had no real friends, no family to celebrate with, and no one to share his life with. Mavic had a personal maid named Josiah, a young woman in her 20s who worked hard every day to keep his mansion spotless. Josiah came from a modest family and lived in a small, cozy house in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. She wasn't rich, but she was kind-hearted, hardworking, and always had a smile on her face. She didn't mind doing her job because she loved making Mavic's home feel warm and welcoming, even if Mavic didn't notice most of the time. One day, as New Year's Eve approached, Mavic found himself sitting alone in his big mansion. The holidays had always been the hardest time for him. He watched people on TV celebrating with their families and friends, laughing, playing games, and eating delicious food. But Mavic had no one to celebrate with. Josiah, on the other hand, was looking forward to New Year's Eve. She had a small family, and even though they didn't have much, they always made the most of what they had. Jessica loved spending time with her parents and younger brother. She was planning to go home for the evening and enjoy a quiet, happy New Year's celebration with them. But that evening, Mavic made a surprising decision. As Jessica was getting ready to leave, Mavic called her into his office. "Jessica," Mavic said, looking out the window at the city lights, I don't know what to do for New Year's. I don't want to spend it alone, but I don't have anyone to invite. You've been working for me for so long. You know this place better than anyone. Would you be willing to come over and spend New Year's Eve here? I mean, I don't know how to do this whole celebration thing." Jessia was shocked. She had never imagined Mavic, the millionaire, would ask her to spend New Year's Eve with him. Uh, Mr. Thompson, I think you should spend the evening with your friends or family," Josiah said, unsure of what to say. "I'm just going to be with my family at home, but thank you for the offer." Mavic sighed, looking down at his hands. "I don't have anyone, Jessia. I know I have all the money in the world, but I don't have anyone to share it with. I don't have a real family or friends like you do. I just don't know how to be happy, and I thought maybe you could help me understand what it's like to have a real celebration." Jessia felt a wave of sympathy for Mavic. She had never thought of him as lonely, but now she saw that, despite his wealth, he was missing something very important: connection. "Well," Jessia said softly, "I'm not sure if it'll make you feel better, but you're welcome to come over to my house for New Year's. It's not a fancy party, but it's warm, and we'd love to have you." Mavic looked at her in surprise. "You're serious? You'd let me come to your house? It's not too much trouble?" Josiah smiled. "Okay, of course not. It's just my parents, my brother, and me. It's a simple celebration, but we always enjoy it." Mavic hesitated for a moment. He had never been to anyone's home that wasn't a luxury mansion or a five-star hotel, but something about Josiah's kindness made him feel like this was the right thing to do. "All right," he said, "I'll come. But just this once, and I promise I won't be a burden." Josiah smiled. "You won't be a burden, Mr. Thompson. I'll pick you up at 7 p.m. sharp." That evening, Mavic arrived at Josiah's house. He was used to grand, glittering entrances, but this time, he pulled up in front of a small, cozy home. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was warm, with lights shining from the windows and the faint sound of laughter coming from inside. Jessia greeted him at the door, wearing a simple dress and a big smile. "Welcome to my home, Mr. Thompson," she said, leading him inside. Mavic felt a little awkward. The house was small, but it had a feeling of warmth and love that he had never experienced before. The walls were decorated with family photos, and the smell of homemade food filled the air. Jessia's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, and her younger brother Ethan, were sitting at the kitchen table laughing and talking. Mom, Dad, this is Mr. Mavic Thompson, Josiah said, introducing him. He's the one I work for. Josiah's parents stood up to greet Mavic, smiling warmly. Nice to meet you, Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Parker said. We're so glad you could join us. Mavic felt a little nervous. He was used to being in control, but here he felt out of place. He had never sat at a simple dinner table like this before. It wasn't about fancy food or expensive drinks. It was just a family coming together to celebrate. As they all sat down to eat, Mavic couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. They didn't have a huge feast, but the food was homemade, simple, and delicious. Josiah's mom had made a big pot of spaghetti, and they had fresh bread, salad, and homemade dessert. Do you like the spaghetti? Josiah's dad asked, noticing Mavic staring at his plate. Mavic smiled a bit shy. It's amazing. I've never had anything like it before. They all laughed, and Josiah's dad made a joke that made everyone chuckle. For the first time in a long time, Mavic felt a sense of belonging. The laughter, the shared stories, and the warmth of the room made him feel like he was part of something real. It wasn't about money or status. It was about being together. After dinner, they played board games, something Mavic hadn't done in years. Josiah's younger brother, Ethan, taught him how to play a game called Monopoly, and they all had a great time. Mavic laughed and joked with the family, something he never thought he would do. As midnight approached, Josiah's family gathered together in the living room. They held hands, said a prayer, and wished each other a happy new year. Mavic felt a deep sense of peace and happiness that he had never felt in his mansion. It was a simple celebration, but it was the best New Year's he had ever had. As the clock struck midnight, Josiah's family cheered and hugged each other, wishing one another a happy new year. Mavic, who had been standing quietly off to the side, was moved by the warmth in the room. It was so different from the lonely, cold New Year's Eve he was used to, spent in his empty mansion. Mr. Thompson, would you like to join us for a toast? Mr. Parker asked, holding up a bottle of sparkling apple cider. Mavic hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to drinking something so simple. It was always champagne or fancy cocktails at his own parties. But as he looked around at the smiling faces of Josiah's family, he felt something inside him shift. This wasn't about the drink. It was about being present, being part of something real. Sure, Mavic said, a smile creeping onto his face for the first time that evening. I'd love to. They all clinked their glasses, and the warmth of the moment made Mavic feel like he had finally found something he'd been searching for all along, a sense of belonging. The evening went on with laughter, stories, and games. Josiah's family made him feel so comfortable that he almost forgot who he was. Mavic Thompson, the millionaire. Instead, he was just Mavic, a man spending New Year's with a kind family who treated him like they had known him for years. At one point, Josiah's brother Ethan asked, So, Mr. Thompson, what's it like being a millionaire? Do you ever get bored? Mavic chuckled, a little surprised by the question. He hadn't expected to be asked such a direct, innocent question. Well, Ethan, I guess sometimes it gets lonely. I mean, I have everything money can buy, but I don't have a lot of real friends. I've spent so much time working, building my business, that I never really learned how to just enjoy life and be with people. Ethan nodded, as if he understood exactly what Mavic meant. That's kind of sad, he said simply. Mavic smiled at Ethan's honesty. Yeah, it is. But tonight, I think I'm finally starting to understand what I've been missing. As the night wound down, Josiah's family invited Mavic to stay for a while longer. They sat on the couch chatting and sharing more stories about their past New Year's celebrations. Mavic didn't want to leave. The simple joy of being with people who truly cared about each other felt so much better than any lavish party he had ever attended. The next morning, Mavic woke up feeling surprisingly refreshed. He had spent the night at Josiah's house, sleeping on a couch in the living room. It wasn't the plush, king-size bed he was used to, but it was the best sleep he'd had in years. He quietly got up and wandered into the kitchen, where Josiah's mom was already preparing breakfast. The smell of pancakes and eggs filled the air, and it made Mavic realize how much he missed the simple pleasures of life. Good morning, Mr. Thompson. Mrs. Parker greeted him with a warm smile. Would you like some breakfast? Mavic smiled back. Yes, thank you. It smells amazing. As Mavic sat down at the kitchen table, Jasia walked in, still wearing her pajamas, and handed him a cup of coffee. "Morning, Mr. Thompson. How did you sleep?" "I slept better than I have in a long time," Mavic admitted. "I can't even remember the last time I felt this relaxed." Jasia's face softened, and she sat down next to him. "We're glad you could join us for the new year. It's not much, but we always try to make the most of what we have." Mavic looked around the modest kitchen, and for the first time he didn't feel out of place. There was a comfort in the simplicity of it all, and it made him feel more at peace than he had ever felt in his mansion. As the day went on, Mavic found himself thinking a lot about his life. Spending New Year's at Jisha's house had changed something inside of him. He realized that all the money in the world couldn't buy the happiness and warmth he had experienced that night. He had spent so many years chasing success, wealth, and recognition, but he had missed out on what really mattered: genuine connections, simple joys, and family. Before he left, Mavic pulled Jesse aside in the living room. "I just want to thank you again for inviting me. Last night, it was the best New Year's I've ever had. You've shown me what I've been missing all these years. I don't think I'll ever be the same." Josiah smiled gently. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. We may not have a lot, but we have each other, and that's what makes it special." Mavic nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "You're right. I think I've been so focused on what I don't have, I forgot to appreciate what I do have." Jessia's eyes shone with kindness. "It's never too late to start, Mr. Thompson. Life isn't about the things you own. It's about the people you share it with." Mavic smiled, feeling a sense of clarity he had never experienced before. "Thank you, Jessia. I'm going to remember this for the rest of my life." As Mavic drove back to his mansion that afternoon, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried about it. He was going to make changes in his life. Real changes. He didn't need more parties or luxury to feel fulfilled. He wanted to spend more time with people who cared, to build deeper connections, and to enjoy the little things in life. That night, instead of spending another lonely evening in his mansion, Mavic called Jasia. "Hey, Jasia," he said when she picked up. "I was wondering if you and your family would be interested in having dinner at my place next week. I want to thank you properly for what you've done for me." Josiah's voice was filled with surprise. "You mean it? You really want us to come?" Mavic smiled. "Yes, I think it's time I start living a little differently. Let's make it a regular thing. Dinners with real friends." Jessia paused for a moment, then said, "I think that sounds wonderful. We'd love to." And so Mavic's life began to change. He still had his mansion, his business, and his wealth, but now he knew that true happiness came from the people around him, not from the things he owned. And with that new understanding, Mavic felt ready to start the next chapter of his life. The next week, Josiah and her family arrived at Mavic's mansion for dinner. Mavic had invited them over with excitement, but also a little nervousness. He had spent so many years in the world of luxury and business, but now he was opening his home to the people who had shown him what truly mattered in life. When Josiah and her family stepped into the mansion, their eyes widened in awe. They had never seen anything like it. The tall ceilings, the sparkling chandeliers, the grand staircase. Everything was larger than life. But despite the wealth that surrounded them, they could feel the difference in the air. The house didn't feel like a home. It felt cold and empty, just like Mavic had felt for so many years. Mavic, wearing a simple but elegant outfit, greeted them warmly at the door. "Welcome to my home," he said, smiling. "I'm so glad you could come." Jasia smiled, but she couldn't help but notice how different Mavic seemed. He wasn't the serious, distant millionaire she had worked for. He seemed lighter, more at peace. There was a warmth in his eyes, a kindness that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for inviting us, Mr. Thompson," Jessia said, her voice soft but genuine. "Please call me Mavic," he replied. "I don't want to be Mr. Thompson tonight. I want to be a friend." As they sat down to dinner, Mavic had made a special effort to keep things simple. The table was set with a homemade meal: spaghetti, salad, and fresh bread, just like the meal Jasia's family had shared with him. The food wasn't fancy, but it was made with care, and the conversation flowed easily. Mavic listened intently as Jasia's father told funny stories from his childhood, and Josiah's younger brother Ethan made everyone laugh with his jokes. For the first time in years, Mavic felt like he was truly part of something. It wasn't about the food, the house, or the money. It was about being with people who made him feel at home. The laughter, the shared stories, and the feeling of belonging were more valuable than any business deal or luxury item. After dinner, they sat around the living room, talking and playing board games. Mavic didn't care that his mansion wasn't being used for a fancy gathering or a corporate event. He was simply enjoying the company of people who cared about him, not for his wealth, but for who he really was. As the evening came to a close, Mavic felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you, all of you," he said, standing up. "This has been the best night I've had in a long time. I think I've finally learned that money and status don't make life worth living. It's the people in your life that do." Josiah smiled, her eyes shining. "I'm glad you understand that, Mavic. It's not about what we have, it's about what we share." Mavic nodded, his heart full. "I'm starting to realize that now. I don't want to go back to the way I was. I want to make time for the people who matter, and I want to spend my life doing things that bring real happiness." From that night on, Mavic's life began to change. He still ran his business, but he made sure to prioritize people over profits. He started inviting Josiah and her family over for dinners every month. He also became more involved in charity work, using his wealth to help those in need, not just by donating money, but by spending time with the people his charity supported. Mavic also started to build real friendships. He made an effort to connect with people who weren't just interested in what he could give them, but who valued him for who he was. And as he did, he felt something he had never felt before: contentment. Josiah too saw a change in Mavic. He was no longer the distant, lonely millionaire. He had become someone who was open, kind, and willing to learn from others. The bond between them grew stronger, and they shared many more meals, laughs, and conversations. Over time, Mavic realized that while wealth could provide comfort, it was the simple things, like a warm meal, good conversation, and the love of family, that made life truly meaningful. One evening, as Mavic and Jessia sat together on the porch of his mansion, watching the sunset, Mavic turned to her and said, "You know, Jessia, I've spent most of my life chasing after the wrong things, but I'm finally starting to understand what's important. I've learned so much from you and your family. I don't think I'll ever forget how you showed me what real happiness looks like." Jessia smiled warmly. "I'm glad I could help, Mavic. It's never too late to start living the way you want to." Mavic smiled back, his heart full. "No, it's not, and I'm just getting started.